There it is.
Okay. All right, class. Welcome back to, let's see what we got here. We are, once again, in English 2323, Brit Lit 2, El Paso Community College class. We're a little bit behind, but that happens in this class. We take things loosely. We're dealing with very important aspects of the Romantic period, and I need to finish up lecturing on that, and we'll try and get through all of that in this session so we can move on. The next thing we will study, and we are a bit behind, but that happens, is we'll be moving into William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, which were scheduled for, anyway, we were scheduled to go through those through the 7th of once again September. So we'll get caught up. That's the main thing. So keep up with your readings, class, as they're assigned on the syllabus, and we'll get caught up. It's very important for us, though, to once again get this firm basing in the Romantic period, the historical text. So I'm going to continue lecturing today in regards to that, so we can have our minds set historically, philosophically, and once again with the politics of the period and the social milieu of what we're dealing with in regards to Romanticism. So last time, class, when we left off, we were talking about things like the French Revolution. We're talking about moving into the industrial age, the industrial era, and we're going to continue that today and try and move quickly through it. And we started seeing these splits too in classes, class, once again, in regards to poverty, in regards to wealth that was happening at this time. Suffering was largely confined to the poor, however, and we're on page 8. While the landed classes and industrialists prospered, so did many merchants who profited from the new markets open to the British Empire expanded aggressively, compensating with victories against the French for the traumatic loss of America in 1783. So we see in before that also that workers in the 1820s had no vote and were prevented from unionizing. Their only resources were petitions, protest meetings, and riots, to which the ruling class responded with even more repressive measures. So we see even echoes of this today, as sometimes the merchant class gets richer and richer and richer, and certainly, the middle class has had challenges, and a lot of critics say has shrunk over the past years, certainly within America. And then the wealth is being concentrated in the hands of ever fewer people. That could be debated either way, but it's interesting that these things, these aspects that were happening in 1820, there's still echoes of this today. Echoes of this today, even though, of course, nowadays workers can unionize. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Once again, fascinating. During this time, too, class, the word shopping came into the English usage. In this era, luxury villas sprang up in London, and the Prince Regent, who in 1820 became George IV, built himself palaces and pleasure domes, retreats from, once again, his very onerous responsibilities that he had as a public servant. So, palaces were made, villas were made. There's a lot of wealth going around. It was being held in the hands of not that many, but the few. And that alteration both put new pressure on women and granted them new opportunities. So we're starting to see some new opportunities for women. As in earlier English history, women in the Romantic period were provided only limited schooling, were subjugated to a rigid code of sexual behavior, and especially after marriage were bereft of legal rights. And this is on page 9. In this period, women began as well to be deluged by books, sermons, and magazine articles that insisted vehemently on the physical and mental differences between the sexes and instructed women that because of these differences they should accept that their roles in life involved child rearing, housekeeping, and nothing more. Okay, so that's going to start unraveling too, were those strict modes. And then, of course, we're going to start seeing women writing and publishing and certainly having more rights as the decades go on. And then we started coming to a situation where the new idea that, as the historian Linda Coley has put it, women's place was not simply in the home. We're starting to have philosophies that move away from that, but also in the nation could all justify or at least extenuate the affront to proper feminine modesty represented by publication, by a woman's entry into the public sphere of authorship. So once again, women becoming authors, having the woman's voice up there. Blue stockings, educated women remain targets of masculine scorn, as we have seen. This became nonetheless the first era in literary history in which women writers began to compete with men in their numbers, sales, and literary reputations. So we start moving into that context of women writing, women publishing, people buying women's writings. Very important in the Romantic area here, 1820 and so. Class. Now, also in this time, there were all sorts of aspects, it tells us on page 10 of the new poetry's theory and practice. We're going to talk about that and approaches to poetry. Writers working in this period from 1785 to 1832. So that's good to remember, the Romantic period, 1785 to 1832. In this period, did not think of themselves as constituting a group of official Romantic authors. It was Victorian critics who first wrote of the previous generation as the Romantics and promoted the term as a description for a period of recent modern rather than pre-modern history. Excuse me, class. Contemporaries, by contrast, treated these writers as independent individuals or else grouped them, usually melancholy, but with some basis in fact in a number of separate of schools or sects. Okay, so we see that even nowadays, right? The different schools or sects of poetry. What class? The sects today, sometimes the outlaw school, which two writers that I knew very well founded decades ago. The New York School, Black Mountain Poetics, class, once again, street poetry, modernism, postmodernism in poetry. Los Angeles street poetry. Once again, it can go on and on and on, the different groups. The Boston School in some aspects. The Y School in once again the YMCA. The St. Mark's School once again in Upper New York. All these different categories. The Beats, the Beatniks once again. All different sects of of poetry. Those are some off the top of my head, of modernism once again. Class, stand-up poetry once again, which is based on a very, very sort of oral tradition, dealing with humor and dealing with easily digestible poetry. Class, once again, the images, or once again, deep image poetry, or what would become later in France. Certainly, what I was reading this weekend and go to all the time is the symbolist, the French symbolist poetry. So all these different sects. And back then they had the Lake School of Wordsworth, who we're going to certainly discuss this semester soon here. Coleridge. Okay. A lot of times some of these poets would be dissenters from the established systems of poetry and criticism, much which happens today. And valuing themselves highly for breaking loose from the bondage of ancient poetry or ancient schemes of poetic verse. Okay. So once again, that's still happening today, but breaking loose from the bondage of ancient authority. The Cockney School, a derogatory term for vulgar Londoners, such as Leigh Hunt, William Hazlitt, and associated writers, who had pretensions beyond their station, including Keats, and the impious satanic school of Leigh Hunt, Percy, Shelley, and Byron. At the start of the period, the satirist also practiced this name-calling as he cataloged the sphere of female literature. So, once again, class, we started seeing these different rebellious strands of poetry that were rebelling against the old, rebelling sometimes of the structures and the chains of established verse. Did it mean it was better? Did it mean that established verse and structured metered verse did not have its place? Of course it did. But once again, breaking up new territories in poetry for what some people would refer to certainly as freedom. Class, the most eccentric feature of this entire culture, literary historian on page 11, Stuart Kernan suggests, was that it was the whole period of Romanticism, and we haven't seen that in culture for a long time, that the culture was simply mad for poetry, to a degree inconceivable in the 21st century. Poetry back then penetrated everyday life as something appearing in daily papers alongside news stories and notices of bankruptcies, death, and marriages, and as something to be memorized, sung, transcribed into commonplace books, and made the basis of parlor games on long winter's evenings. The calling of poet beckoned to many. Okay. Among those hordes of devoted readers, many were too eager, their reviewers complained, to become authors in turn, imagining that verse might provide their springboard to fame. If those enthusiasms laid the ground for confident declarations like Shelley's and Wordsworth's, they also inevitably generated a backlash. And the more so as the new poetries of the Romantic period rode to this cultural prominence on the back of a media culture that at this moment was reaching increasing numbers of readers more quickly than ever before. So once again, there were a lot of people entering into the game, into the life, and a lot of what they say here were hack writers. Okay, certainly not the caliber of Wordsworth and Shelley, who we're going to dig into in the next month deeply in this class. The genius poet was therefore shadowed throughout the Romantic period's literary discussion by a less admirable double, the Grub Street hack. Poet could, in this era, designate the visionary and universal benefactor profiled in Wordsworth's preface and Shelley's defense of poetry, but it also invoked an impoverished and pretentious truant from a more honest trade, a misguided romantic scribbler. Okay, so we had that too. And the Grub Street hack, what they're talking about when they talk about Grub Street is that place in England, in London, where the publishing houses were, where the newspapers were, and they were once again pumping out copy, making deadline, daily newspapers, weekly newspapers, small stories, once again, small segments of poems, once again. Class. The last phrase of the Grub Street hack, often bandied about in this era, reminds us that even as the term romantic became synonymous with an admirable responsiveness to the promptings of imagination, it never completely shed its association with a deplorable and impracticable deviation from common sense. Interesting. Okay. The poet's haunt was, in mundane reality, likely to be a shabby, low-rent attic. Many motives drove the poets who in this area tried to make poetry new by reviving what was old and who thereby contrived to bypass the 18th century poets, whose heirs they were supposed to be. Their medievalisms and primitivisms were, for a start, reactions now against the neoclassical canons of good taste, as well as expressions of a new nationalism. But certainly ideas about literary's past exemption from the commercial pressures of the present also helped make the outmoded old romances a radically new source of inspiration for this period, precisely because of, rather than despite of, their historical distance. All right. The double image of the poet, product of an era that both idealized poetry and fretted over its standing in modern commercial society, is an important context for the questions centering Wordsworth's 1802 preface, his retroactive statement, the principles guiding him in the poems he contributed to lyrical ballads. What is meant by the word poet? What is a poet? The questions were more urgent because in a fractious period there was increased pressure on the aesthetic sphere to act as a safe site when human beings could rediscover the commonalities linked them as humans. As Wordsworth's definition of the poet as a figure of unification, together, bringing together the vast empire of human society suggests. By taking this approach, we take our cue from Wordsworth's preface. We should also acknowledge that his manifesto for a new poetics can be deemed representative only to a limited extent. So, that grasping for the new. That grasping for what, as we're going to see ahead, grasping for essence, which we're going to see. The essence of what? Maybe some aspect of God, maybe the essence of nature, maybe the essence of man's harmony with nature, maybe trying to transcend banal society at that time and look for the universals, like maybe happiness. How is happiness found? How is meaning found? what is man and woman looking for? All these things that Romantic poetry was trying to grasp for in a new way. The Romantic poetry is interchangeable on page 13 for many modern readers with nature poetry, an equation that William Godwin Whittier endorsed when he reprinted Mary Wollstonecraft's essay under a new title on poetry and our relish for the beauties on nature. This characterization of Romantic poets linked downplaying the poet's emphatic attention to operations of consciousness. Certainly many poets participated enthusiastically in the touring of picturesque scenery that was a new leisure activity of their age. But class, it wasn't just trying to capture, once again, the nature of the time, but man's place in it, and once again also transcending it to something larger, a larger consciousness. Wordsworth, Coleridge, and the Lake School even set up their households in the midst of that scenery, announcing in their residential arraignments as well as their works their antipathy, being against the increasing accumulation of men in cities and faith in the restorative powers of benevolent nature. So that grasping for, as the cities become more packed, the cities becoming more industrialized, the city becoming more intense with workers, this grasping for getting outside of that and getting back into aspects of nature that would provide what? Spirit, healing, truth, possibly God consciousness, however God could be defined. And maybe some aspects of, possibly nirvana. Even so, it is fair to say that when the great Romantic lyrics of Smith, Wordsworth's Tinternal, Coleridge's Frost at Midnight, and Keats' Nightingale remarked on an aspect in the natural scene, this attention to the external world serves only. The attention to the external world serves only as a stimulus to the most characteristic human activity, and once again, that of thinking. So once again, the process of consciousness in nature, thinking once again in nature, and sometimes trying, we'll see here, to get beyond soul thinking, once again, soul thinking, solely thinking, and into that consciousness of what could nature provide? How could nature move? Once again, sometimes the poet from the analytical head, but once again into the heart, into that spirit place. Class. Very good. Now, page 14. For male poets, the risk of poetic self-realization were different, and in some measure they were actively seized by those who, like Coleridge and Percy Shelley, intimidated darkly that the introspective tendency and emotional sensitivity that made someone a poetic genius could also lead him to melancholy and madness. Okay. So we start seeing that take on poetry that was certainly before, but now would continue and continue to this day. It's interesting that when they talk about Shelley, that Jim Morrison of the Doors, of the rock band of the Doors, was a huge fan of Shelley, and of course Jim Morrison descended into madness and melancholy, depression. Once again, but that's just sort of an archetype. Certainly isn't all the types of the poet nowadays. Where we've come so far beyond that is to realize, how can someone not self-destruct? How can someone get well? How can someone deal with poetry and not succumb to aspects of melancholy and madness? That's where we've come so far in health, etc. Still, it persists. Spontaneity and the impulse class, once again, of feeling. So let's talk about this. Page 14, class. In traditional poetics, poetry have been regarded as supremely an art. Excuse me, an art that in modern times was practiced by poets who had assimilated classical precedents, were aware of the rules, the set out rules governing the kind of poems that they are writing, except for happy touches that, as Alexander Pope said, are beyond the reach of art, deliberately employed tested means to achieve premeditated effects on the audience. So in the decades before, classical rules of rhyme, classical rules of structure, classical rules of classicism and neoclassicism in some aspects, that would determine the poem. But in her 1797 monthly magazine essay, Mary Wollstonecraft foretold a shift in aesthetic doctrine when she wrote that the silken wings of fancy are shriveled by rules, and that a desire of attaining elegance of diction occasions an attention to words incompatible with the sublime and passionate thoughts. In Wollstonecraft and Wordsworth's account in a preface, although the composition of a poem originates from emotion recollected in tranquility, and may be preceded and followed by reflection, the immediate act of composition must be spontaneous, impulsive, artless, and free from the rules. All right, so once again, the poet's job was, according once again to Wordsworth, was to not be hampered by the rules of and the structure of classical poetry, but what was most important is feeling, spontaneity, capturing essence, and once again, capturing power of the moment, of the essence, of the situation, and having that come to the poem instead of the rules that may dilute that or destroy it. Fascinating. Is it right? Who knows? Certainly it is an aesthetic manifesto that in many aspects we're still working with today. Okay. Poets are still working today with offshoots of romanticism. And then once again, craft coming into the careful paying attention to the language and the lifelong dedication to the language. Okay. The immediate act of composition must be spontaneous, impulsive, artless, and free from rules. Okay. Keats listed as an axiom a similar proposition that if poetry comes not as naturally as the leaves to a tree, it had better not come at all. How fantastic that is. All right, so that's trying to once again find that absolute essence of purity. Keats. So he said one of the rules, or one of the standards by which the poet must live by is poetry should come as naturally as the leaves to a tree. And if it doesn't, it better not come at all. So that's fascinating. Nature poetry, natural poetry. Once again, rather than being confined by rules. Class. Now, when after the end of the Napoleonic War, page 15, writers like Byron and Percy and Mary Shelley traveled to Italy, taking these bardic ideals with them. So they were getting tired of them. They were tired of the very formal classes in England, and they felt that they could find some freedom and some new expression and some new tapping into a more freer world in Italy. Taking these bardic ideals with them, they became enthralled with the arts of the improvisation and the improvisator, men and women whose electrifying oral performances of poetry involved no text, but those of, once again, immediate inspiration. One writer who praised and emulated that rhapsodic spontaneity, Percy Shelley, thought of it in error to assert that the finest passages of poetry are produced by labor and study. So it's fantastic. Shelley saying that once again, it's an error to assert that the finest, once again, works of poetry are produced something by labor and study. Maybe when too much work is involved, too much sweat, too much paying attention to the rules of classicism, that once again, the poetry is stripped of any essence of life. Interesting. He suggested instead that these were the products of an unconscious creativity. So that's what he saw in Italy. Unconscious creativity, which is still the goal of the poet. Once again, unconscious. How does the poet on one level get out of here and into here? Okay. Yeats talked about that. The great, once again, Irish poet, the Nobel Prize winner of modernism, William Butler Yeats, which we will finish at the end of the semester, once again, said that he didn't so much as write his poems as have them dictated to him. Whether that's right or wrong, I've debated with people over the years. I say, of course, it's right because he was meditating, he was praying. He said the ancient gods of goddesses and even the fairy folks of Ireland delivered those poems to him. It's like, wow, what a trip. Do I believe that? Personally, yes, I do. Because it certainly happened to me on my own path too, as a poet, as an author, as the publisher that I have of 12 books of poetry. The least last one in 2018 from the University of New Mexico Press. The dedication to the life and then the receiving of the words, and not always, struggle, but they come from where, who knows? That's the mystery. That's the great mystery. Is it God? I don't know. Is it the spirit realm? I don't know. Is it the dedication of daily writing for decades and decades and decades? I don't know. Possibly. Is it the nonstop reading and opening to the verses of multitudes of writers? Possibly, but I don't know. I'm sure Shelley didn't. Some people would claim to have all the answers in regards to this, in regards to romanticism. I don't. But I have questions, and I can speak of it as a professor and as a practicing writer. Okay? As a practicing writer, someone who has worked daily with poetry for 35 years. Where does it come from? We don't always know. And that's the beauty and the mystery of it. And that's what Shelley talks about. He suggested instead that these were the products of an unconscious creativity. Not so much like analytical thinking, I got everything be thought out perfectly, but unconscious. Where? From where? From nature, from the wind, from the leaves, from God, if someone believes in that, from the spirits, from the past generations, from ghosts, from the fairy people. Yes, maybe, and no too. Not always class quantifiable. Not always quantifiable. But certainly in this class we can look to these things. And we can discuss them, class. A great statue or picture grows under the power of the artist as a child in the mother's womb. Wow, how heavy is that? Look on page 16. After he says that, he suggests instead that these were the products of an unconscious creativity, then he said a great statue or picture grows under the power of the artist as a child in the mother's womb. There it is. Let's hear that again. A great statue or picture grows under the power of the artist as a child in the mother's womb. So once again, do we know everything about how a child grows in the mother's womb? No. Can we control everything there? No. But still it happens. And generally still then 9 months later, a baby is there. And you're like, how did this happen? Sometimes people say it happens by surrendering. It happens by letting it happen. It happens by not thinking so much about it. It happens, and here is the baby, here is the child, right? As any mother or father have fretted when a baby is coming. Will the baby have difficulties? Will the baby come out okay? Will the baby have two heads? Will it have, mental defects? All these things that goes through a parent's minds, or many parents' minds. And then all of a sudden, the surrender and saying, hey, it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And then what? The baby. When the baby's out, and you're like, oh man, what am I going to do now? How am I going to raise this? How am I going to take care of this? Class. That's surrendering. That's surrendering. Once again, a great statue or picture grows under the power of the artist as a child in the mother's womb. Unbelievable, class. So that working, but also that surrendering to say, hey, we don't know what the final outcome is going to be. We don't know what the child is going to become. But then the miracle of childbirth, the miracle of the child class. We're going to wrap this up here today once again. So that gives us a really wonderful basis that we've discussed and we've gotten through of the Romantic period. So with this basis for the Romantic period, now we can continue on. We've dealt with history. We've dealt with politics. We've dealt with poetic approaches. We've dealt with philosophy. All these things put in this context for where we are: 1820, 1830, 1840, 1850, 1860, 1870 class. All these times of the Roman coming up soon to, soon what will be 1900 class, not that long ago. The emphasis in this period on unlabored art and on spontaneous activity of the imagination producing it, and the premium placed on the immediacy of the relationship between the author and the poem, are linked to a belief in the essential role of passion class. How important is passion to these Romantic poets? Very, very important. So the question is also, you need to ask yourself, and I need to ask myself, how important is passion to you? Now, my hope for you as students at El Paso Community College, if you haven't already, maybe you have, maybe you haven't, maybe you will, maybe you won't. But my hope for you is that you find some passion here. What should I study in school? I don't know. It's up to you. But my hope always is what will happen to you is what happened to me at the community college, is that I found something that I could be passionate about, somewhat, or at least opening the doors to it. For me, it was writing and literature and poetry and journalism. And so for you, hopefully you'll find something. Maybe it's becoming an accountant. Maybe it's in sports. Maybe it's in basketball. Maybe it's becoming a doctor. Maybe it's becoming a lawyer. Maybe it's becoming a nurse. But if you're going to become a nurse or any of those things, hopefully you can find somewhere along the line, passion. And if it doesn't happen right now, stay open to it, class. Keep digging in. Keep taking a wide range of classes. And then when you find it, go for it. And don't sweat it. Life is this beautiful thing. Passions can come and go. But my hope from the depth of my soul is that you can find something that's going to motivate you in life and let you get up in life. Sometimes it takes time, class. So be good to yourself. Don't beat yourself up about it, class. Now, according to this new view, which connects the literary productions of the Romantic period to the poetry and fiction of sensibility written earlier in the 18th century, the intuitive feelings of the heart had to supplement the judgments of the purely logical faculty, the head. Deep thinking, Coleridge wrote, is attainable only by a man of deep feeling. So it's not all cold analytical thought, but getting into that place of, once again, out of the head and into the heart, into that place of feeling. Hence, a metaphysical solution that does not tell you something in the heart is grievously to be suspected as not so much based in truth. So, excellent, class. So there it is. There's our basis for Romanticism for our days ahead. My next lecture, we are going to be moving into the great William Blake, Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, and then right into Robert Burns and into the Tam O'Shanter and Robert Burns' great song, A Red, Red Rose, and The Old Lang Syne. And class, those are the days ahead. So bear with me, class. I'll have another lecture in a few days. Stay up with your readings. Good luck, good luck, good luck, class. And I hope you have a wonderful week. Thank you and good luck.